Well, welcome back, listeners, to HTO Football. It's myself, Andrew Timble, joined by my partner in crime, Tom Whitford. Are you well this week?
I'm very well. So I think we're starting to get to nights that are starting to get slightly lighter. I'm always looking forward to, when the evenings start to get a little longer. I mean, we're still at it getting dark by 4:30, but at least it's 4:30, not 4 p.m. So it's starting to feel a bit more positive about the year. Who knows, amongst everything else that's going on. But yeah, really looking forward to today's episode.
Yeah, who we got lined up, Tom?
We're very excited, everyone, to welcome Caj Sohal, the exec producer of football documentary Two Tribes. Caj, thank you very much for joining us. Hope you're well. How's your year started?
My year has started pretty much as the year ended, with me in the attic. Really hoping that I can go into an office very soon and do some work where I might actually meet people and have a chat and talk about things and maybe go to the pub.
I know that would be a novel, wouldn't it? I moved job actually in the summer, in August. So whilst I still feel myself a little bit new to my new firm, I've been there 5-6 months and I've not stepped foot in the offices yet. So I'm gonna by the time I go back, I'll have been there for a year and I won't even know where the toilets are. So
you'll be a veteran by then, yeah?
Absolutely.
Inside the building.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. Obviously, we are delving today into Two Tribes, and what are tribes to belong to, and but also just looking at the era of football that was the 80s, and obviously the Liverpool Everton divide, but in many ways a City United at certain points through that decade. So first of all, how did you get involved with the project? How did you hear about it? What was your interest personally?
So my background has been mostly sport and football broadcasting. So, in the past I was, actually first job I used to interview players and managers post-match for BBC 5 Live in the 90s. So I knew a lot of these players from those days, from standing in drafty tunnels, trying to get people to stop and speak to me when they'd lost. And then after that, I worked in various other industries and was Match of the Day football focus at the BBC. And we set up our own company probably about 10 years ago. One of the things we really wanted to do, as well as live sport, was sport films, documentary films. And the sort of films we wanted to make were set in sport, but weren't really about sport, I guess. So they weren't about who scored the most goals or the best team or, who won the most FA Cups, but they tended to be stories that were set in sport. So the first one we did, I think, was about the Bradford Fire, called One Day in May. I think I can't remember when that was, about 2012, 2013, which was with Gabby. Father was obviously involved, was coaching Bradford on that day. And then from that story, we made a few more. We made one about race and football for the BBC, about it's an astonishing story about a testimonial in 1978, I think it was, for Len Cantello at West Bromwich Albion. And it was an all-black team against an all-white team.
Wow.
Which is very little footage of it left, but it's still an amazing story. And then we did that, and then we did things about Admiral. We did a program about Admiral, the kit suppliers, who effectively invented the idea of the replica kit, and then in great British tradition managed to cock it up and let the Germans take over and make the real killing in that industry. But that was great fun if you remember those particular Admiral kits that England used to wear and Leeds wore in the 70s. And then we did one about football stickers. And so we've always had like 4 or 5 ideas. And I worked quite closely with Andy, the director. So the two of us spent a lot of time in pubs, sort of saying, do you remember when? Do you remember when? And things like that. We're about the same age. So we do remember this sort of era. And we were looking for an idea of a story that would tell a wider story of the 80s. And I can't, for the life of me, I can't remember how it started, but we both knew a little bit about the story, and we were both quite into the film side and the music side of what fall together to tell this story about Liverpool, the city. Because I think, at that time, it was a remarkable record, wasn't it? I can't remember exactly, but I think they won 8 titles out of 10. Stayed on Merseyside in that period. And it was really picking that apart. And then we found some footage an old documentary that was on Granada about following some fans going down to the League Cup, or the Milk Cup as it was that year, and when Liverpool met Everton, and that's really how the story started for us.
What was the sort of, did you go in with some sort of plan of how you wanted it to come across for the viewer?
Yeah,
what you were trying to achieve.
So I always think when you're making a documentary, there's kind of, you need one of three things. You either need a celebrity on board to get it made, as you've probably seen from lots of TV, or you need unique access, which would be something like the stuff you see on Amazon with Spurs, or you need an untold story. And I think this was an untold story, in the sense that you'll see films about HTO, and you'll see films about Hillsborough, and you'll see films about Everton. But I don't think there's ever been one about the entire football in the landscape and in the context of what was going on. So I think what we wanted people to see is that if you were of the time, hopefully this would reawaken some memories and thoughts about that different footballs. And if you were younger and hadn't experienced it, it was an opportunity to shine a light. And again, because the football experience, as in a player and a fan, in the 80s compared to now, is completely it might as well be a different sport. So yeah, we wanted to give people an insight who didn't know, and for the ones who did know, we wanted to give them a kind of reawaken those thoughts and ideas.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's when I watched that the first time round, I was aided by those kind of interviews, aren't there? The snippets that that puncture the whole documentary constantly. You're getting different angles from activists and players and fans. I thought it was that also something you were mindful of kind of making sure you get a range of opinion.
I think so. I mean, the city of Liverpool is such an interesting place. I mean, all cities have their character. You can say that about Newcastle, you can say it about Manchester, but Liverpool almost, has that famous banner I think they had at one point. We're not English, we're Scouse. Has this outward facing. I don't think it faces towards England. It definitely faces towards Ireland. Feels like an Irish city. And it faces outward. And I think it's port cities tend to do that, don't they? Then port cities like Liverpool that went into decline in the 80s, I think became slightly insular. And when we started to uncover some of the history of it, and you realise that at a time when cities and populations are growing and growing, Liverpool lost a huge amount of people in the 70s and 80s. I think it was like, almost more than a third of the population left Liverpool. It actually got smaller. And that does something to people. And we wanted to reflect how football was such an important component in that, because what you saw, and again, this is interesting in Liverpool, because there's a story in the 60s. The rest of Britain loved Liverpool, couldn't get enough of Liverpool. Whether it was,
I think there was a band from Liverpool or something like that in the 60s. I can't really remember, something along those lines.
Well, not just one. That was the thing about Liverpool.
Well, quite, yeah.
Because I think it was, and this stat probably isn't true, but I think it was right. I think it was 50 weeks out of 60, a Liverpool band held the number one spot in a period in the 60s rather. So that's 50 weeks out of 60. There was a Liverpool band that was at number
and
one.
Only 49 of those were the Beatles. No, I think you're right. And the thing that came across for me is that we've been really fortunate enough to interview a few documentary makers previously, and we had we really enjoyed the Sunderland Till I Die chat, because about how equally, again, that was obviously a northeast club rather than a northwest, but like how they're so intrinsically linked to what's going on in their city, the football club. But I think almost no more than Liverpool. And it's just that era just before the birth of the Premier League, isn't it? Just before actually football superstardom went on a ridiculous level, where actually the populist culture, whether that be socio-political or whatever, it was still very much reflected on the football pitch and with the clubs. Whereas I think you almost get a detachment now that no matter what's going on, and we're seeing it in the Premier League ongoing during a pandemic, that actually show must go on. The Premier League's almost so far removed from its people. It's just a show unto itself. And I think the 80s really captures the last era where that wasn't the case for me anyway.
And I think also football was not cool. In the 80s, if you were a football fan, that was not a cool thing to be. Whereas now it might be different, and lots of people are. And we I don't know where you place that change. Probably you're a 96 where it became something that would be for everyone. In the 80s, football was not for everyone. And you might even keep it quiet that you were a football fan. And we heard it a lot because we talked a lot about music in the show. And we spoke to, people like Echo and the Bunnymen and Pete Wiley from the Mighty War and other people. And a lot of them said the same thing, was at that time, you kept your fandom under your hat. Because in music fields, that was not a cool thing to be into.
Yeah.
It didn't really cross. And so that was the interesting thing at Liverpool, but it did, in the sense that you get this feeling that it's a bit like the American equivalent. We looked at it was Detroit, and what happened with music in the 60s was when a city's under severe pressure, when it's been being battered and battered and battered, like Liverpool was through whether it's the media, whether it's through jobs, whether it's politics, whatever.
Yeah.
You sometimes get this massive explosion of creativity. And in Liverpool, it came out in music, and it came out in the 80s, and in film, and Alan Bleasdale, and Bread, and Brookside. It was ridiculous, but also in football. And those are the things that give you hope, and also, to a certain extent, I think, dignity. I think football gave people dignity at that point when they were at their lowest. It gave them something. And then it was, ironic that football was the one thing that took it away from them in terms of Heysel and Hillsborough after that.
Yeah, well, you mentioned Heysel there, Caj, and I thought it was a fascinating section of the documentary where I think is it Lawrenson that talks about the sort of the guilt and the shame about that's almost been pushed under the carpet. And ironically, a minute ago, Tom mentioned about football sort of at the moment is the show must go on. Yet ironically, the players that night and even fans that were saying that the show shouldn't have carried on that night. How was that to kind of report on and kind of chart?
Yeah, we spoke to a lot of people about that, and when you get into the subjects of Hillsborough and Heysel, it is tricky. It is tricky, and I think a lot of people in Liverpool will say that the city didn't handle it well, and the club didn't handle it well in terms of Heysel. And it was difficult. And I know Loro, and I've known him for years. I said I used to do that job at 5, so I've known him since then. And he said at the time, first of all, they didn't want to play, but felt they were told that if you don't, there might be a riot and it could get worse. So they played. And secondly, they all felt that more could have and should have been done to commemorate that. But it was, he tells, fascinating stories about, because I think he had to go to hospital for that game because he got an injury or something, and then had to be smuggled out through the back of the hospital by armed guards to make sure that he wasn't attacked. So it had a huge effect on a lot of the players. I think more than ever's really been chronicled.
What pressure did Laura or anyone else you sort of worked with during the creation? Was there a sense of pressure that they felt? Like you said, there's so much going on, and in many ways, the city and the air and the region, not just the city, getting battered in many ways, but actually on the pitch, obviously, as we said, for the 80s, phenomenally successful for both clubs. Did they therefore, was there a sense of pressure that actually they maintain that for the city? Actually, it is one of the few fantastic lights at the time. It is another creation piece of carry on from the 60s, 70s. Did they feel that? Was that something that was burning?
I think footballers, even then were well paid, but the gap wasn't as big as it is now. So, their interaction with other people, especially the Scousers, like the Steve McMahons and the people like that who grew up in the city and played for both clubs, were well aware of what it meant and what it meant to the wider, population of Liverpool. I think they all did, to be honest. I don't think any of them were unaware of how bad things were in the city. They were bad. They were bad. Some of the estates and other places around there were in a bad way, and they were aware of that, and they were aware of what the reputation of Liverpool. We talked about earlier. In the 60s, everyone wanted to be Beatle, Cilla Black, everything. People loved them. By the 80s, and I think Jimmy McGovern says something, and I'll have to paraphrase him, it'll be wrong, but it was something like, how do we get to this point where by the 80s people would believe that Liverpool fans would steal from the dead and piss on the bodies, and it would be believed, and you think in the 60s, that's what everyone wanted to be. So how did you get from there to there? And in that middle period, so if you played for Liverpool, or if you played for Everton, you knew what it meant. You definitely knew what it meant to the city.
Yeah, there's some fantastic shots, isn't there, of that adulation being sort of mirrored on your piece, where the fans are running on the pitch, sort of embracing Rush and Sharp at Everton.
Yeah.
We don't see that anymore. Firstly, you're not allowed on the pitch for a start.
You're not allowed on the ground at the moment.
What was just great to see in the piece, Caj, is that for all the ups and downs through that decade, and the turmoil and the resurrection, as it were, and the music and the culture, whatnot, throughout the whole piece, there was this kind of hope. And was that something that you wanted to be a thread throughout the whole documentary?
Do you know, it's funny, with documentaries, because you go in with an idea of what you think it is, and it'll develop a life. And certain things that you think are going to be really important become background, and things that you thought were background suddenly become the central issues. So it moves around, and it depends so much on what people tell you. I remember Colin, one of the fans, the Everton fan that we found on the video of that Milk Cup thing, and his really honest recollections of that period, and what it does to you, and what say unemployment does to you as a young man, and what it strips you of, especially back then in terms of your self-worth and all the other things. And it would have been easy to sink into that morass of desperation, but everything that happened that's creative was optimistic. It was hope. All of Pete Wiley's songs were about, there was an exodus from the city, and it was like, come back. It's about telling people, come back, we need you. We can make this city big and strong and everything else. And it's an incredibly vocal city. You can't, filming there is great, but it takes forever, because you'll stop and buy a newspaper and you'll be there 20 minutes. You're not going to get in and get out again.
Yeah.
I was going to... more than having the long conversations, I was going to ask, actually, from a creating the show perspective, what was the biggest challenge then?
Biggest challenge is always getting somebody to pay for them to get the documentary made. That's always the biggest challenge.
Fair. Well, yeah, like
once you'd overcome that one.
Yeah, so look, we have probably about 10 ideas bubbling along at any given point, and we're trying to convince various people to do it. So the challenge, I think, really is because this was we made this for BT. So BT is, as you know, is a sports channel. This film isn't just a sports film, so we had to go to them with an honest view that, look, if you think this is going to be about Liverpool scored and then Everton scored, then Liverpool won and then Everton won, and it's not going to be. This is what we want to do with this. There's always an element of compromise in any film you make with the commissioners, but that's not what we wanted to do. And they were brilliant with it, and they said, no, that's exactly what we want this film to be. So our challenge really wasn't that. Our challenge was getting it all in, I think, really, because it was just it's such a long story, and you feel like you want to tell it all, and there's great swathes of it that we didn't tell. But yeah, I mean, that's it. And I think also we had a screening at the Everyman in Liverpool before the film went out. And that's always scary, because you've got 150 local people, and you're in Liverpool and you're looking for the exits, wondering, can I get out of here, if they really hate it. And luckily for us, they didn't. And I think we didn't want it to be sycophantic. It wasn't going to be something that's just going to whitewash over everything. It had to be an honest view. And I was pleased that in fact, everybody said that's what they felt it was in Liverpool. They thought it was accurate. And so that was a good thing for us, I think.
No, I was going to. Sorry, I was just going to comment on that and say and ask and how it was received in the city. And obviously, kind of you captured that there. But when we asked the biggest challenge or pressure point to some other documentary makers, it was when you go back and you show this to the people that it's about, the city that it's about. When you're telling that story, you're ultimately telling the story not just of one or two people that you can therefore check throughout the documentary making if they're happy with it. You're actually telling the story of hundreds of thousands of people ultimately. And so you can't really litmus test, or you can have your test pull throughout, can't you? But you can't really say how's the city going to receive this until it's too late.
It's really hard, because I think what you're not trying to do is to be too preachy about it. You want to sort of open a window to a story and show people the different sides of it that they might not have seen, to understand, I did, because we all know Scouser jokes, right? We all know, but it's just interesting to know where that comes from and how that developed and where did it start, and but equally we'd say that some of the people in the film probably are maybe a little bit too chippy about it in terms of what happened. Some of them couldn't, Pete Wiley still gets annoyed by any Scouser joke about ever any whatsoever.
I found that interesting.
So you save your best ones for him.
I think I know where it comes from. It's probably just if you're battered over the head again and again and again and again and again, it gets to a point where you no longer see the funny side of it.
No, exactly. I found that interesting, that part as well, where who you were interviewing, their kind of real frank take on how stereotypes almost just went completely wrong, didn't they, in that regard?
Yeah. I mean, look, when Bread, if you remember the sitcom Bread, 21 million people used to watch that. Right, so it started off being quite sympathetic, and it was written by, I think, Carla Lane, Liverpool. It's a Liverpool Crew, but by the end, it was used as a parody, and that was the problem. As we always said, in the film, in one of the treatments, it was like, Liverpool was a city where it was from, she loves you to gives a job, basically, and then it was used as a slur, a slur against people.
Well, you're talking about an era there where there's 3 and then eventually 4, but 3 channels on the telly. Whatever gets seen, the whole country's seeing. Globalization hasn't properly happened, right? This any stereotypes, jokes, personas, they're getting embedded very quickly. People are still seeing things in spitting image. Do you know what I mean? People are still seeing that now because just is what people remember, and it's probably pretty hard to shake.
Yeah, and it probably went through that decline before any other city. Of that 80s decline that hit a lot of northern cities, because the ports really suffered and the docks suffered when the UK's entry into the European common market, funnily enough, when all the ports in the south became the most important ones and not the ones in the north, and the trade stopped and the cruise liners stopped, and it was falling apart before everyone else, basically. And if you think about, almost a quarter of the population was out of work.
Yeah,
that's astonishing.
So you understand that social landscape, isn't it, when you're watching and creating a piece like that as well. I wanted your take on a part of the documentary that was quite emotive. I felt right at the end, where I can't remember who it was now, but he said, like, what would that film, or what would that decade look like if Liverpool and Everton weren't the football teams that they were? Firstly, Caj, would you even have been in a position to make it if it was completely different with those football teams, and what would it have looked like if you'd have gone ahead with it?
Well, if we were making it for a non-sports channel, then, you potentially could make that film without Liverpool and Everton being a success, because it would have focused and it would have gone heavily on the other aspects in the politics. Because obviously, the Derek Hatton story is just amazing in itself, what Liverpool was doing in sort of local politics. So you probably could. But the football for us, that's where that was our road in. That's where we started, the story, and that's where we started our research. So I think, that was important. But it goes back to that time, when you're absolutely at rock bottom and you lose your self-respect for yourself, almost, or self-confidence, because you don't have any, because you don't have enough money to properly buy your kids a new trainers or whatever that you wanted to do. And remember, you're looking at a British society, which at that point, you were always better off than your parents, who were continually building and building. Here's a generation that definitely were not going to be. And, I can't remember, Colin's brother, I think he showed us his CV once. And his CV had about 40 different jobs, because every time I went to a factory, it closed down, and then it closed down, and then it closed down. And things were going so quickly. And what the football did, it just gave you something to be happy about. And also, it was very much a male world in terms of football then. And for men, it was, I think, an escape.
Yeah, definitely.
It was an escape, and it gave you something to be proud of.
Yeah, I think football will always be an escape for fans, won't it? But I just think that there's probably, if you take off your producer hat for a second, Caj, and maybe think, well, there's parts of that documentary where you think you look at Heysel and you look at Hillsborough and you think, yes, okay, fan behaviour has improved, stadium safety has improved a hell of a lot, hasn't it, over the last 20, 30 years? But is there part of the game now, and we always like to ask our guests this, particularly the ones that have been working in film, is there a part of the game as a fan, Caj? Is there a part of the game now that you feel that you don't love as much as it was then?
I know. I mean, do you know what? Things I miss. So I'm a Nottingham Forest fan. So I grew up in Nottingham, born in Nottingham.
So success is probably.
So yeah, winning.
Yeah.
Or scoring a goal right now, quite frankly, is one of the things I miss. Yeah, we Forest are not going to have to be worried about any COVID regulations about players celebrating together because we haven't scored a goal. But I think I miss standing with my mates. I miss that element. So in the old, when I was younger, we used to stand on the Bridgeford end, which is opposite the Trent end. There used to be a standing terrace, open terrace, to get soaked. But I knew I could turn up there at 2 to 3 and somehow find 4 or 5 people I knew, and then we'd all get together. I missed that element. Now you have to plan like you would plan going to the theatre or anything else about, who's going to get the tickets. Can we get there in time? Can we get them all together? No, we're not. We're going to be sitting here. I miss that element of it. There's lots of things I don't miss, I have to say.
And I think as well, there's probably like part of fans now that feel ashamed of the sport in different ways. If you look back at the 80s, when hooliganism was rife, and it was probably not a proud statement to say I'm a football fan in this country. But now, there's certain other things, aren't there, that aren't particularly tasteful, really, when you think about the pandemic going on, and yet games are going ahead and clubs are spending millions and millions of pounds in the transfer markets.
Whilst getting big loans.
They're different, yeah, exactly, and there's different types of factors involved now, aren't there? In the shame of a fan, I guess.
I think is the club your own anymore? Because comes into it, I mean, fandom seems to be tremendously fluid. You hear now, back in my day, you had a club and it was your local club.
Yeah. I wonder, because I completely agree with all those sentiments from both of you. I just wonder whether that's just us getting old, and actually, because it's also you attach it to a point in your life, don't you, as well? So Andrew and I are Arsenal fans, and obviously '89 is a relevant year for when you're discussing Liverpool at any point, especially Liverpool in the '80s. But one of the great things about that documentary film as well is obviously, and the stories themselves, the Arsenal players obviously come down after the success, and they're sort of celebrating in the local pool hall that evening until the early hours in the morning with Arsenal fans. And now we reflected when we were chatting to Alan Smith about that night, and he said, "Oh, it's amazing." But he said physically that couldn't happen now. One person tweets something, and there's millions of people there. You cannot have that attachment with your club. And so I think there has been a fundamental change. As much as I know it's just because I'm becoming an old fart, I actually think we are more distanced to our club. That for many reasons, the Sky boom in the 90s was fantastic for football, but in many reasons it did take it away from cities. But can
you imagine Ian Rush doing a Q&A on Twitter with his Liverpool?
The other thing, it's even I would say to a certain extent, it's even more recent than that. So when I was working at the BBC, we used to do World Cups and whatever. And so I'm thinking about, when was Germany? 2006.
Yeah.
Players that were working with us and doing stuff, right? We would still go out. These are some of them were current players, but obviously not playing and injured or whatever. We'd go out and have beers and whatever else in a night out, and it could be really late and we'd still be out. No camera phones. Couldn't do that now.
Yeah.
Couldn't do that now because it'd be snap.
It's also the year that Arsenal left Highbury, so I think that's the moment where football gods and gods in general. I miss Highbury so much, obviously, and they decided that football doesn't deserve to be such a special place now because you've decided to leave Highbury, and that's the reason.
You can usually blame it on Arsenal, can't you?
Yeah, well, quite, but no, yeah.
Forest give Arsenal your set of kits, which is why you wear red, isn't it?
Forest did, yeah, absolutely. That is the story. We'd like to ask this question to people who produce any films or create. What other sports documentaries have you loved recently, and not your own?
God, I love ours. Are brilliant. Ours are brilliant. Everyone says The Last Dance, don't they? The Jordan one.
Yeah,
because
it's incredible.
It was such a big piece of work, and again, as I said to you earlier, it's about access.
Yeah,
anything with access.
Unfettered access, and sat on it for so many years, really. sat on that axis for 22 years. 24
back then,
years.
because it's harder to film.
Yeah.
It's harder to film now. We can send somebody out with an iPhones and we can use the quality of that footage and to make it into a really decent film. So I really enjoyed that. And there's what else have we watched recently? I'm trying to think. I enjoyed the Edge, the cricket film. We're working on a boxing film right now. So I've been watching some old boxing documentaries. And boxing's just great for that because boxing is just. I always describe boxing as sort of 1/3 sport, 1/3 entertainment, and 1/3 criminality.
Yeah.
But you're never quite sure which third you're going to get in a given moment.
In every respect, yeah.
You do when it's Mike Tyson involved. But
well, get all three at the same time.
Yeah.
So I think it's a great time actually for sports documentaries right now.
Yeah.
For stuff like the stuff with the Amazon stuff with Spurs.
Yep.
I get to the point probably where I just fast forward to the bits where Mourinho's talking in the dressing room. That's probably all I want to see. But I think if the story's told well, that there's such a wealth of films out there that can build on this. There's the obvious ones you've seen like the Maradona. A lot of them are sort of like not that great. I don't think which have access, but not a lot. Films about Ronaldo, people like that. I think probably like that. Those are fan pieces.
Yeah.
Essentially, if you're a fan and you want to see what his wallpaper looks like in his bathroom, then it's brilliant. But for me, the best ones are always that give you an insight that you hadn't thought of before. Yeah. And I think, obviously, I really love I Believe in Miracles, the Nottingham Forest film about the European Cup win that Johnny Owen made, which is great. So I think right now, in the next few years, there's going to be a real explosion of that. And I think there's some good storytellers out there who can take it beyond what they used to be, which was the story of the season.
You mentioned your upcoming boxing one. Is there anything else you want to give a shout out to, or promote, and or just give us listeners a little bit of an insight to?
Well, we're slightly hamstrung by COVID at the moment. I think we had about 5 days filming left on this boxing film in February last year, and we've got 5 days of filming left. Film because it's set in Belfast, so it makes it a little bit difficult for us to get out there. I think when that comes out, which will be about a boxer called Eamon McGee, who led the most astonishing life and won a world title and was in the IRA and been stabbed, shot, beaten, you name it. Everything's happened to Eamon. I think that's where most of our attention is going right now, or it will do once we get going. We got 2 other films that were football based, which are bubbling along, which I can't really say anything about just yet, but again, a similar vein to what we've done. One of them based around London, I guess, and the other one is just about two great personalities in the 70s. So, yeah, it's a rich minefield in footballing stories. We really still want to make the Don Revie film, which we put a lot of work into, and we were very close to doing, because I think there's a man who needs to be revisited, and look at his charge sheet and say how true are some of the things. I mean, some of the things he did were just visionary, compared to what we have now. I don't think we would, probably, the first British team to probably take the ball in the corner, when you're sort of winding down. All the things that they did are things that people are considered to be like good practice and professional now. But back then in the 70s, it was, it was terrible. And we were really, really interested to hear and discover that the phrase, because, when you say to football fans Leeds, and you will hear the phrase dirty Leeds. The first use of that phrase was actually in an FA publication.
Really? That's brilliant.
He came up with dirty Leeds.
Yeah.
What people thought of them at the time, but it is a fascinating story.
Untold stories on HTO, isn't it?
Yeah, they'll probably release a statement saying, all such statements around calling fans saying dirty Leeds should be banned, and it will trace it back. It was them they started it,
It was them who started it, yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
That's been an absolute pleasure, Caj. We took a lovely recap of 2 tribes. We've got a 3-man tribe on HTO today, so yeah, welcome.
No, we really appreciate that. It was great chat.
I'll let you know when the next one's out, and we'll come back and tell you all about it.
Well, Eamon McGee, book it in.
Brilliant.
We love boxing as well. Well, we love
Oh,
boxing as well.
Everything in that case.
Yeah, take care, Caj. Thanks for everything.
No problem.
Time.
Thank you.
Cheers up.
Yeah,
Bye.
bye.
I really enjoyed that chat. That was really nice, wasn't it? Caj, top bloke, top man.
Yeah.
But just I genuinely, and you shouldn't have favourites, should you? You shouldn't have favourites. But if I look at all the catalogue of specials we've done, I really do find myself drawn to these chats around sort of sports documentary creation. Obviously, in the midst of our HTO Film Series, and personally, it's up there for me.
Oh, 100%. And I think as well, we're both quite passionate about this with our, uni days, and we do like to pick apart, meaning behind things, particularly in sports documentaries, and to get the chance to talk to these sorts of people is fantastic, really. I mean, a brilliant piece. What was fascinating was watching it. I had to keep reminding myself that this is supposed to be a rivalry, really. Liverpool and Everton. Yet it's probably one of the very few derbies where there's so much love involved more than hatred.
Yeah, and obviously sort of vehement dislike of each other's teams, but equally very passionate about where they're from in the city. And I think that's for me what really differentiates these sports documentaries and these football documentaries from like a normal pod with a normal guest. Not that they're all fantastic, if any of them listen, but that we're talking about the clubs and the cities, and we're talking about such a wide populace of people and the verve and the feeling that they feel for their club. You're not necessarily drilling down into one individual player or one individual match. You're actually saying, what does the game mean to us as a fan base? And ultimately, that's what we are at heart, is fans. And just final shout out, that Eamon McGee boxing film sounds a great one. We'd have to get that on and get Caj back on to talk about that at some point, because that sounds a cracker.
Yeah, big boxing fan, so that'll be fascinating.
Absolutely. We might have to watch the Nottingham Forest one just to placate him before the next one, just to say, look, we have seen it, just to make him feel a bit better.
Just mentioning what you said a minute ago as well about the whole kind of it's the untold stories, but the access again, because when you watch that back, there wasn't particularly tons of footage where it's like, oh, I haven't seen that before, but it was more the interviews, the access to
And like you said, the untold story, no one had ever looked at it, the angle of Liverpool as a city through the eyes of two teams, and I think he's right. The best documentaries are either telling a new story or they're showing you something that you've not seen before, i.e. unfettered access. But obviously he said The Last Dance, we'll have to get Michael Jordan on to talk about that. Just a small little
I've dropped him on his Gmail, but still
not replied to my WhatsApp either, so keep on listening, listeners. We might get Michael Jordan on if he replies to the WhatsApp.
Wait a minute. No. But I thought he
sorry, that could be great. You just wait a minute, it could be great when the music kicks in. We should just close that there, because when you say wait a minute, that'd be quite funny. I think we should do more of that sort of stuff, because I think wait a minute.
But I think as well the Caj chose the right Frankie Goes to Hollywood track, didn't he, for the name of the documentary? I don't think he could have gone with Welcome to the Pleasure Dome.
No, not for Liverpool in the 80s. Music was such a part of it, like I said, so I think they did a really good job with the soundtrack throughout, to be honest with you. Such an important part.
And also, as we knew with the Sunderland one as well, they're always an integral part of the how it's received.
Yeah, maybe we should ask them about that, actually, given the fact that the music was such a part of the Liverpool. Did he feel extra pressure to get the music right for the dog?
There's a good question for you guys who are listening. So what's the best sports documentary soundtrack that you've come across, part of our film series? You could answer that look out for the tweet on Twitter at HTO Football.
Until next time all.
Yeah, take care, guys.